Well, thank you all very much for taking the time to be here. For those on the commission, thank you for really an extraordinary amount of work, and not just a lot of work, but an extremely high-quality product on a very difficult topic. So we thank you very much. Maybe for those people who don't know who's in the room, maybe we'll just go around the table. Chief, if you could start, please.
Certainly. Steve Krokoff, Chief of the City of Albany.
Good afternoon, Melanie Hartzog, Executive Director, Children's Defense Fund, New York.
Good afternoon, Anthony Pacenti, Oneida County Executive.
Good afternoon, I'm Sophia Elijah. I'm the Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York and co-chair.
And I'm Jeremy Creelan, also co-chair.
I'm Jackie Green, Executive Director of the Commission.
Good afternoon, Madison County Sheriff Alan Riley.
Good afternoon, Joe Mancini, Probation Director, Schenectady County.
Emily Tao Jackson, Executive Director of the Tao Foundation.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to ask the commission to go through the report. Before we did that, let me give you a little context. This is a slightly different situation than we've had in the past when it comes to the state of the state address. State of the state is this coming Wednesday. It was postponed because we had some personal issues early on. But the state of the state is basically an announcement of the policy themes that we're going to pursue for that year. And normally in one address, although it's somewhat lengthy and somewhat boring, don't tell anyone I said that, it goes through the full litany of all the policy proposals that we want to pursue. They then become pieces of legislation, and the legislature decides what to do with it. But normally the state of the state contains all the policy proposals. We had an abundance of policy proposals this year, which I guess is a good thing. And they were not simple policy proposals. They dealt with many complex problems that we've been trying to solve for a very long time. And the complex problems don't resolve themselves to 30-second explanations or 30-second solutions. It takes time to understand what they are and really work your way through them. It's one of the reasons why they're complex problems. It's one of the reasons why they persist so long. Government doesn't have a long attention span. If you can't describe the problem in 30 seconds, and if you can't describe the solution in 20 seconds, it's probably not going to happen, right? You have to get everything down to a bumper sticker. This is one of those issues that has gone on for a long, long time without resolution. And an issue, frankly, where we have done a lot of damage in the meantime. Your imagination can paint vivid pictures when you talk about exposing a young person to a state prison. For those of us who have spent time in state prisons, I can tell you the reality is worse. And I've spent time in a state prison in an official capacity, I can assure you. But the reality is actually worse than what you would think. So we announced that we were going to put together a commission of the top experts, let them really take the time and work through the issue, and have the issue ready in time for this legislative agenda, which is precisely what they have done, and precisely what we're going to go through now. It will then be included in the State of the State address, but in the 30-second capsulized version, because that's all the time will allow. We've done that with several other issues. We have some economic proposals that we've already discussed and laid out in detail, housing programs that we're going to pursue, a really robust housing agenda, a robust minimum wage agenda. So live and learn. This is my 5th State of the State. Hopefully they get a little better each time, right? Otherwise I'm not doing my job. But certainly this is the most complex, policy-heavy state of the state and policy-heavy agenda that we've ever put forth. The challenge is now going to be to get the legislature to actually pay attention and work through the policy. But this is Albany, this is government, so one challenge at a time, stone to stone across the morass, as someone used to say. With that, let me turn it over to Mr. Jeremy Creelan, who will start off the presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Governor. I'm actually going to turn it over to my co-chair, Sophia Elijah, briefly, and then I'll go through the presentation. Sophia?
Okay, thank you. Well, today we celebrate the life
On
and
behalf of the
legacy.
members of the commission and myself, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to serve on the commission and to develop this report on this critical issue. Before we jump into our findings and recommendations, I just want to add a word of context here. Now, as in so many areas, New York was actually once the unquestioned leader in juvenile justice policy. And ironically, New York State was actually really the first state to choose to place juveniles convicted of a crime in separate facilities from adults. This is the House of Refuge in New York City on Randall's Island, started in 1824, and in 1846, the legislature actually put into law that the House of Refuge would be the place, the exclusive place where juveniles would be housed after being convicted of a crime. Now, in many ways, as a result, the effort that we're focused on today and in this session is making New York State the undisputed leader in this area once again. And that process of reform in this area has already, of course, started thanks to your leadership. In 2012, you achieved passage of the Close to Home initiative. Instead of warehousing juvenile delinquents from New York City hundreds of miles away, and thereby making it much harder for them to repair and strengthen their social and family connections to their community, New York City youth are now being placed in or around their communities and getting the programming and the support that they and their families need. You also achieved major changes to the law to require detention decisions, whether a youth is detained, to be based on an objective risk assessment tool rather than just someone from probation looking at the files and reviewing the files. That reduces implicit racial bias, it avoids unnecessary detention, and it promises to save precious resources formerly spent on detention. And in 2011, you established for the first time a permanent funding stream for community-based interventions to help youth and families as an alternative to pretrial detention. Counties are now reimbursed at a higher rate for such interventions than they are for detention, which is good for youth and communities, good for counties, and good for the taxpayer. And last but far from least, you created the Justice Center to stop abuse inside facilities, and the Justice Center is already making a major difference curbing such injustices. So you've already established a tremendous legacy of reform in this area. Of course, there is still work to be done, and despite New York's early leadership, by the middle of the 20th century, New York had already started to lag in some key respects. By 1927, most other states had raised the age of criminal responsibility, 28 states to age 18, and many of the others to 17. New York was still at 16. And New York is now one of only 2 states that treat 16 and 17-year-olds as adults for all purposes in the criminal justice system. That was the reason why you appointed our commission, and that was our starting point. Now, over the past several months since April, and thanks in large part to the support of the Vera Institute for Justice and the foundations that generously supported the effort, the commission's work has been about as deep and as extensive as any commission I have seen. And in the space of less than 7 months, a remarkable amount of work has been done. There were 14 focus groups with over 200 participants all across the state, over 40 interviews with stakeholders and national experts, intensive data analysis, weekly meetings about the current system, public hearings with over 20 witnesses. We consulted in person with leaders from other states, Illinois and Connecticut in particular, that have gone through this process. We visited jails, detention centers, juvenile facilities, Rikers, residential treatment facilities. And as a result, we've come up with a series of findings, which I'm going to allow my co-chair, Sophia Elijah, to go through. Sophia?
Thank you. Well, what areas did we find were in need of reform? First, and perhaps the most well-known, is the impact of detaining 16 and 17-year-olds in adult jails in prisons before trial and imprisoning them in adult prisons after sentencing. Nationally and here in New York State, the research has shown two key facts. First, youth of that age often suffer horribly inside adult facilities. They're far more often than adults to suffer from sexual and physical abuse, mental health deterioration, tragic outcomes, and often they fare and suffer from low-level crimes. And second, and I would suggest that anybody
Really well done, great work product. I'm going to ask the panel, the rest of the commission, if they have any other comments. A couple of comments myself first, because this is very provocative. I started my career in the Manhattan DA's office, and I quickly got the sense in the Manhattan DA's office that it was too late. In the Manhattan DA's office, you see the same case over and over and over and over again. It's a 17-year-old, an 18-year-old who's in trouble. It's the second or third time they've been in trouble. They've gone through the juvenile programs, and now they're headed for state prison. And I was convinced at that time that we have to get there earlier. This is Martin Luther King weekend, Martin Luther King Day. One time in my life, when I was HUD secretary, Coretta Scott King calls and asks me to do the Martin Luther King address at Martin Luther King's church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was obviously a great honor and also scared me to death. So I spent weeks researching Dr. King and to prepare for this speech. And one point that stuck with me from Dr. King, we tend to think of the nonviolent resistance, the passive resistance. His whole theory was a very activist intervention. And he spoke at length about how if you don't provide the early services, the early education, et cetera, then it's going to be too late when a person gets to the later teens. And in many ways, that is what is happening. When you hear the rest of the state, the thing I feel best about, it is front-loaded, if you will, on this situation. Finding jobs, these are the highest unemployment rate, young African Americans, young Latino men. Finding jobs, job placement, job subsidies, making the education system work finally. You look at the census tracts where a lot of people who go into the criminal justice system are coming from. They're the same census tracts that have the failing public schools and have had failing public schools for a long time. Our failing public schools in this state, about 250,000 children have gone through what we call failing public schools. Can you imagine that? While we sit in this building, talk about it, 250,000 children go through failing public schools. So in many ways, we want to get there before this even happens, right? We understand that. One of the proudest legacies I can leave when I'm finished with this job, which I'm aiming for, sometimes it's not what you do, it's what you don't do. I want to say that I closed more prison cells than any governor in the history of the state of New York. And I believe we're going to get there. So the early intervention, I understand. Question then is, unfortunately, if you do get to this point, what do you do? And this system sounds like it makes a lot of sense to me. Two questions I have just in terms of implementation and going to the practical. This approach sounds like it creates a different type of facility. We have Commissioner Annucci here and Deputy Secretary Terry O'Leary. This, as I take it, is a different type of juvenile facility than we now have. This is a violent juvenile in a small residential facility.
I can address that now. So some of the capacity, some of these 16, 17-year-olds, will presumably go to existing capacity at OCFS and the existing facilities. But there, to the extent there is a need for additional secure juvenile capacity, there may be a need we expect and model there to be a need to develop new capacity. And we think it's an opportunity for New York State to really lead in that area. When you have a blank slate and you're doing it anew, it should really meet best practices. And one of the things that's interesting in the research we found is that if it's 25 beds or smaller, it actually qualifies for Medicaid funding as well. So you get potentially, much more federal funding for some of the intensive services that are provided at the facility. And the recidivism numbers at some of these, the smaller facilities that they have in Missouri are much better than, a much larger facility. So it's basically a recommendation to take that as an opportunity and not just expand capacity, but do it in a way that really helps reduce recidivism.
The state that had the best model facility would be Missouri?
Yeah, I mean, a number of other states too are, have done this, but Missouri is sort of the gold standard, right? So they have, and OCFS, to their great credit and to your administration's great credit, have adopted a lot of the steps even in existing facilities as part of the New York model, which is kind of a version of some of the things that they've done in Missouri. So the thinking is that if you really are creating a new facility, though, you have an even more latitude to do it, right? So.
Second question is, you talk about youth parts.
Right.
What do you see, how do you define a youth part
Right.
in the court system?
So that would be essentially a courtroom that would be presided over by a particular judge whose job it is to handle only the 16, 17-year-old cases or the other juvenile offender cases of 13, 14, 15-year-olds. So that they would be specially trained in, the brain science and in what adolescents need, the kinds of family services that are needed, the intensive multidimensional therapy, foster care. They would know really, like some of the family court judges do, how best to handle those cases. They would develop that expertise. And so that even if a case stays in criminal court, because it's a very serious offense, it would still be handled differently than it is now. And, that's a proven concept, and the recommendation is that that OCA do that across the state, and I think they've indicated, Judge Mark was on our commission, they've indicated that that's doable, and that's the right way to go. Because you really want, even if it's handled in the criminal court, you want it to be handled well.
Great. Well, very convincing to me. Questions, comments? Don't be shy just because there are 100 people looking at you. You get used to it after a while.
Before people jump in, I just want to add, I would be remiss if I didn't add, I want to thank the members of the commission.
Somehow zero sum. And that for some reason, someone has to suffer if we try to improve things like justice and equality for a group of people, and it somehow has to translate to negative outcomes when it comes to public safety. What this commission will show and what the report will show is, in fact, the opposite is true. We are going to be able to achieve all the things we need to when it comes to justice and equality, all while reducing crime and victimization. And this is an incredible step forward for the state, and I thank you for your leadership on it.
Thank you. Thanks, Chief. County Executive?
Governor, thank you for your leadership on this and for bringing this forward, because like everyone has said, this is not something that this has been lingering, and it's something that needed to be discussed and vetted out, and I believe that the commission has done a great job. I'd like to really just, on behalf of the commission, to thank